Outside of the Pentateuch, no book of the Old Testament has been subjected to as much scrutiny as the book of Daniel. Many subscribe to the theory of a late date of composition for Daniel in the time of the Maccabees, around 168 to 165 BC, rather than the 6th century BC when Daniel was said to be alive. Many modern radical critics hold that the book was completed in its final form in the Maccabean period, but some allow for parts of Daniel, mainly chapters 1 through 6, to have had an earlier date of composition. Some also say the editor in the 2nd century used certain traditions to compose the final form of Daniel. In this series we'll focus on arguments relative to the historicity and dating of Daniel. There are quite a few such arguments, and some of them get pretty technical, but I'll present here only those that strike me as the most interesting. For the rest, I'll provide a link to my detailed article on the subject. Our next objection concerns the personage of Belshazzar, and we might begin by noting that it was once argued that Belshazzar did not exist at all. With that in mind, now that critics assent to his existence, they're reluctant to grant him his due as he is represented by Daniel. Let's see how. Daniel's representation of Belshazzar is criticized on two grounds. One, that he was not a king, and second, that he was not a son of Nebuchadnezzar, as Daniel indicates. Let's start with the second one first. One generally used reply has been that by ancient usage, the term son often referred to a successor in the same office, whether or not there was a blood relationship. This is true, but it can be even stronger and more literal. Belshazzar's literal father was Nebuchadnezzar's successor, Nabonidus, who was a usurper. Monarchs who were usurpers commonly tried to legitimate their claim to the throne by marrying their predecessor's wife or daughter, and we know of Babylonian kings who followed this practice. Do we have specific evidence for this in Belshazzar's case? No, we have none for or against it, but Daniel might just be our only evidence for it. It is probably significant that Daniel was no longer recognized as a wise man who the king immediately called on, which would fit in with the idea of a usurper cleaning house for his own protection. Now what about that first aspect, Belshazzar being king? In reply to this, some experts have noted that there is evidence that Belshazzar was elevated to a secondary kingship, a common practice in ancient times in order to secure a peaceful succession. There are documents, for example, that attest that Belshazzar presented sheep and oxen at the temples in Sippar as an offering of the king. In addition, the Greek historian Xenophon, reporting on the fall of Babylon, says that the king was slain. He doesn't name this king, but since Nabonidus was in custody at the time, and since Xenophon describes this king as a riotous, indulgent, cruel, and godless young man, which would be a bad description of Nabonidus, Xenophon must be referring to Belshazzar. Our next objection set concerns Darius the Mede. Darius is regarded as a fictional character, or at the very best a confusion with someone else. But what does the data tell us? There have been a few ideas about who to identify Darius the Mede with, but I find the strongest match identifying him with the monarch who actually conquered Babylon, Cyrus the Persian. One step to this is to translate Daniel 6:28 in this way. It would require a reading of the Hebrew grammar that is known from another parallel in 1 Chronicles 5:26. The identification seems to be supported by the Septuagint, which translates Daniel 11 as the first year of Cyrus, rather than the first year of Darius. But why the two names? That one's not too hard. Many people of that era had 2 or more names, and we see that even in Daniel. But then why emphasize the name Darius over Cyrus? We can't be sure, but one suggestion is that Daniel was emphasizing Cyrus's Median bloodline, his father was a Persian but his mother was a Mede. And supposedly he did this in order to demonstrate the exact fulfillment of earlier Old Testament prophecies of victory by a Mede. In the end, the present evidence does not tell us who Darius the Mede was in an explicit way, but we have a plausible identification. The question is whether there is anything wrong with it. I haven't found any serious objections to it, other than the typical fundy atheist, "why isn't it so explicit that it smells stronger than my boxer shorts" sort of objections. One thing we can point out is that confusion of Darius the Mede with someone else, or just plain inventing him, would have been quite impossible. Ezra 4 has a list of Persian kings, and as Josephus indicates, there were many histories which would include information on the Persian Empire in the circulation at the time of the Maccabees. We even know some of those histories today. In reply to this, one fundy atheist remarked that many Americans today don't know who the president was during World War II. But the person who wrote Daniel, if he was in the 2nd century as the critics say, would have had to have been in the most educated class. There's really no comparison. He could hardly be expected not to know who was in charge of Babylon at the time of Cyrus. Next up, Daniel depicts an episode in which Nebuchadnezzar temporarily goes insane. Critics call this scenario unrealistic and ahistorical, but what does the record show? The first objection to the scenario is practical. One critic claims that it is unrealistic because someone would have put Nebuchadnezzar to death if he had shown any sign of weakness. There are a few answers to this, but the one that is most direct is that unlike today, anyone who went insane was thought to have been touched by the gods. Since kings were already regarded as leading receptors for oracles, no one would dare to harm Nebuchadnezzar while in a state of madness. If anything, a mad king might well have been seen as a blessing to be cherished and protected at all costs. The other main objections to this episode are historical and refer to the lack of confirmation in other records. But that's not quite accurate. Commonly cited is a testimony from Megasthenes, who reported that shortly before he disappeared, Nebuchadnezzar was possessed of a spirit and uttered a prophecy against Babylon. While this is also sometimes dismissed as legendary, we may at least derive from it that there was some historical precedent for the idea that Nebuchadnezzar had some psychological problems. More directly, a cuneiform text provides some support for the historicity of the episode, as it apparently refers to some mental disorder on Nebuchadnezzar's part, and perhaps to his neglecting and leaving Babylon. Josephus also affirms this episode of madness. The only real issue is trying to fit this madness into the chronology of Nebuchadnezzar's life. Critics claim it can't be fit in, but I have not seen the naysayers produce a chronology as a demonstration. They'll need to consider that the specific term used is rather vague. It's commonly translated years, but it could mean seasons, and it may not reflect a 7-year period, but a period of as little as 2.5 years. As with many historical events, it may be that only one source, in this case Daniel, provides the level of detail we're looking for. What's in a word? According to critics, a late date for Daniel is shown by late words it uses. Let's have a look at that. The first sort of words critics point to are loanwords in Greek and Persian, words they say require us to date Daniel late. But call the critics to account on this if they are not specific. The number of Persian words are only 15, and they're largely government and administrative terms we'd expect Daniel to have learned while in service to Darius the Mede. The Greek words, meanwhile, are but just 3 in number, and they all refer to musical instruments. There's more than enough evidence of Greek influence on Babylon for that to be explained. The other linguistic objections relate to Daniel's primary languages, Aramaic and Hebrew. It's been said that the Aramaic was written in Western dialect, which indicates a late date. Aramaic was the lingua franca of a territory ranging from India to Egypt, and from Arabia to Assyria and Persia. It's the language we would expect an exile to use in the court of a foreign king. Recent critical scholars have admitted that the Aramaic of Daniel is much closer to that of the Elephantine papyri, such that they're now arguing that maybe this type of Aramaic stuck around until the 2nd century BC, so they can still say Daniel is late. The matter of Hebrew is a little more ambiguous. Thousands of years can go by in Hebrew with nothing changing, so it's difficult for anyone to say that the Hebrew dates at such and such century. Some would say this argument is irrelevant anyway, since there's evidence that the whole book was originally in Aramaic, and that the Hebrew is a later translation. Why was this done? This may find an answer in our final question: why does the book use two languages in the first place? We don't know for sure, but it may have been done to make it harder for non-Jews to read and understand the prophetic parts of Daniel. As a final note, Daniel uses a number of Assyrio-Babylonian words, about 20 of them. We wouldn't expect to find those in a document written at the time of the Maccabees. That's a look at the linguistic issues surrounding Daniel, and the close of our series on the book. As noted earlier, there's more detail in the article linked in the vid description of the series intro. See you next time.